You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Nalipat kami dito 2016. Ano ngayon, 2022 na, wala pa kaming tubig na sa bahay talaga. Wala pa.
Saan po kayo bago kayo nakatira dito?
Sa Fisherman, San Jose.
San Jose, sa coastal po kayo.
Yes po. Barangay 88.
I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and in this episode of Teka Teka News, we talk climate migration. The voice you just heard belongs to Jinky Montilla. She and her family used to live and make their living by the coast and city center of Tacloban. But after Super Typhoon Yolanda obliterated most of Tacloban City, they were ordered to permanently move some 30 to 40 minutes away. Jinky and her family are the quintessential climate migrants, forced to relocate by and in anticipation of further calamities brought about by climate change.
Rarely, it is only one reason that causes people to move. Rather, there are different drivers of migration, political, social, environmental, demographic drivers.
Migration has long been a pressing and complex issue for the Philippines. But did you know?
And all of these drivers can be influenced by climate change. The World Bank has done an assessment looking into the middle of the century, looking at internal movements. And in the context of climatic changes, the number of people moving will greatly depend also on how ambitious our emissions reductions are and how far global warming will go until then. So it is clear that there is a great diversity of movements occurring in the context of climate change, and that there is a spectrum between voluntary and forced movements, early planned movements, and reactive movements.
That's Kira Vinca, head of the Climate Center at the German Council on Foreign Relations. She spoke at the Nobel Week Dialogue event held last December 2023.
And also outcomes of these movements can vary greatly, from adaptive migration to really maladaptive migration, poverty spirals that occur and that trap people in poverty for years to come.
The Philippines is profoundly shaped by migration. We continue to be one of the foremost origin countries for migrants around the world. The United Nations in 2019 counted 5.4 million Filipinos living abroad. In 2022, the Philippine Statistics Authority tallied 1.96 million Filipinos who were working abroad. The remittances they sent home that same year made up 8.9% of the country's GDP. But did you know that internal migration is prevalent in the country too?
Yung problema ko lang is yung tubig. Kasi naano kami dito 2016, nalipat kami dito 2016. Ano ngayon 2022 na, wala pa kaming tubig na sa bahay talaga. Wala pa.
Paano kayo naliligo?
That's Jinky Montilla again, a survivor of Typhoon Yolanda. When it struck parts of eastern Visayas 10 years ago, including Tacloban City, where Jinky lives, it was the strongest cyclone ever recorded. I spoke with Jinky last January 2023 in Villa Diana, one of the many housing sites built by the government in the aftermath of the storm.
Ilang taon na po kayo?
Ngayon, mag-31.
31.
Yes.
Okay, ano po trabaho?
Sa ngayon, nasa bahay lang.
When I met Jinky, she had just returned from Kuwait. She worked there for 3 years but returned home to help her husband with their 4 children.
May asawa po.
Yes po.
Oo, nagtatrabaho siya.
Dito lang sa bahay, nagda-drive. Hindi naman yung permanente siyang may trabaho, nagluluto kasi, baga marami siyang skills, walang permanenteng
Being further inland has kept the city's residents safe from the storm, but it has also presented a whole host of issues, including the high cost of transportation and the loss of livelihood for some. In Villa Diana, where Jinky lives, there's another major problem to contend with. You heard her mention it earlier. Residents haven't had access to running water since they moved in. For Jinky's family, That means they've been paying for water by the barrel for 7 years and running.
₱3 yung isang jug. Wala pa talagang direct. Yan talaga yung pinaka main na problem namin kasi di namin alam kung kailan pa kami lalagyan. Kasi syempre importante yung tubig sa atin, di ba? Yan yung ginagamit natin sa lahat.
The latest available data from the United Nations counts over 500,000 people displaced within the Philippines as of 2019. A vast majority of these internally displaced persons, or IDPs, 364,000 to be exact, were forced to move by natural disasters. That includes storms, floods, and earthquakes. Here's Kira Vinca, head of the Climate Center at the German Council on Foreign Relations again.
In the year 2022, there were almost 32 million people internal displacements because of weather-related phenomena. This is happening at only a little bit more than 1 degree of global mean temperature increase. Not all of these movements are attributable to climatic changes, but we know that the frequency and intensity of extreme events is increasing.
The rest of the IDPs tallied in the Philippines in 2019 were displaced by conflict and violence.
I have seen in many places that the governance structures and the social security systems don't really enable people to use migration as an effective adaptation strategy. Rather, they are often entrapped in poverty after moving, maybe also because their skills don't match the labor markets of their destinations. One of the people I interviewed in the south of Bangladesh, a person that has moved from a tropical cyclones from a rural area into urban poverty settlements, says, "We can only survive here. We were better in the village when we had our own land. Now we are like beggars." These movements are part of climate injustice, especially the forced movements, because the people who are on the move and the countries from which they are from have not really contributed to global carbon dioxide emissions and therefore had not contributed to global climate change. Yet, if they are forcibly moved, they are faced with the protection gap.
Experts warn that migration may boom if we cross a critical global warming threshold. More on that after a quick break.
In the middle of the century, if we limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, we'll have around 80 million people on the move because of climatic changes.
A 2-degree bump in global temperature is what experts call a critical threshold. That means if the globe warms any more than 2 degrees, the adverse effects of climate change will compound and become increasingly dangerous. Here's what crossing that threshold might mean for migration.
It will be around 170 million people on the move in a business-as-usual scenario where we burn more and more fossil fuels.
Again, that's how things might look in 2050 if we cross the 2-degree threshold. Citing a World Bank study, Vinca gets even more specific. If the globe warms by 4 degrees by 2100, there will be 1 to 3 billion people living outside the climate conditions that have been conducive to humans thus far, or the climate niche.
People already live outside of this human climate niche, but it will be difficult to accommodate so many people, 1 to 3 billion people outside of the human climate niche. And the question will become, will they move or will they face very dire conditions? In the most extreme cases, uninhabitability of territories arise. For example, through the frequency of extreme events, you can imagine very frequent, intense tropical cyclones occurring, or because of physiological thresholds, heat thresholds, or because of security implications, or because of territorial loss, sea level rise.
So far, we've heard about climate migration as an adverse effect of global warming. That reality is most acutely felt in countries like the Philippines, the least responsible for carbon emissions, but the most vulnerable to natural disasters. That's why, as Kira Vinca mentioned earlier, climate migration is a form of climate injustice. But it's more complicated than that. Climate migration, when done correctly, can be a solution as well, possibly the only solution for those living outside the climate niche. Here's an example.
This is a very pressing issue, has been also reflected in the recent agreement between Tuvalu and Australia, Tuvalu being a small island nation threatened by sea level rise. And this agreement has allowed Tuvaluans to migrate in the future to Australia because of the changes in the climate.
Australia is the world's 14th largest greenhouse gas emitter as of 2023. Agreements like this one are rare, but there is a path toward making them less so.
I've just returned from the international climate negotiations in Dubai, and there climate migration is also a topic in the context of losses and damages, a fund that is currently being negotiated.
Of course, nothing is final. Developed countries are still wrestling with the idea of shouldering the cost of what is essentially climate reparation. And that's not the only hurdle. In many countries, vilifying migrants is an effective political tool, often wielded by politicians.
Migration will be one way to overcome the dangers of climate change. But of course, if we go into the higher warming scenarios, we see that more people will be on the move. How do politicians engage with this topic? I think with some hesitancy, because already there's a lot of criminalization of migration happening. There's a lot of scapegoating of migrants happening. And there's hesitancy to provide for new groups of people, for example, people who move in the context of climate change, liberty to move. Rather, we hear about more constraints on movements.
Last 2023, developed countries pledged $400 million to set up a loss and damage fund. The breakthrough deal came after decades of lobbying at United Nations climate talks from vulnerable countries, including the Philippines. Manila will sit on the inaugural board for the fund, which means we'll get a say on how it's spent. Kira Vinca, head of the Climate Center at the German Council on Foreign Relations, is hopeful that the historic fund will account for climate migration too.
And I guess one big thing from the COP negotiations that's quite positive is this loss and damage. How is migration integrated into that?
It's not yet clear because the text is not fully agreed until the negotiations are formally closed. But there have been some at least placeholders in the text that allude to also migrants, refugees, whether they are moving in the context of climate change or whether they are moving for other reasons, that they should be considered in this loss and damage fund, because also refugees who move from for other reasons, they're very much affected by climate change, because a lot of the refugee camps are very prone to natural disasters. The settlements themselves are not very robust. Migration can be a way to avoid further losses and damages. It can be an act of liberation from danger, from persecution maybe, but also from climate change. It may be a collective act of hope.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. Pidoy Blanco edited this episode. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior news editor is Veronica Uy. Thanks for listening.